I can still hear the crack of that beer can opening, a sharp hiss that sliced through the lazy Texas heat. The smell of barbecue hung thick over the backyard, sweet and smoky, the kind that clings to your clothes for days. Mom's birthday banner drooped over the porch light, already curling at the corners. Martin, my stepfather, stood by the grill with his usual smug grin, spatula in one hand, a cold can in the other. I'd brought my salad like always, quiet, polite, doing what the dutiful daughter does. He raised his beer like a toast, loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. "When your mom's gone," he said, pausing for dramatic effect, "that house should go to my boy. Blood stays with blood." The words hung in the air, thick as the smoke from his ribs. Someone coughed. My cousin fiddled with her phone. I watched the sunlight glint off the metal lid of the grill and thought, funny, how easily men mistake silence for weakness. I smiled and said, "Good thing the tax office doesn't take blood as payment." A few nervous laughs rippled through the tables. Martin's face went red. "You wouldn't have that house without your mother's help," he barked, the kind of bark meant to humiliate, not to argue. Mom stared at her plate, her hands twisting a napkin. I could feel my pulse behind my teeth, that cold surge of anger that doesn't show on your face, but burns steady somewhere under your ribs. I wanted to stand up to remind everyone that I'd bought that house 10 years ago, paid off every loan, every repair, every broken pipe and cracked tile with my own 2 hands. But there's no point arguing with people who rewrite history every time they open their mouths. So I just took a sip of sweet tea, stood up quietly and said, "I'll get going." Long week ahead. As I walked toward my car, I caught the sound of his laughter again, big and hollow, the kind that dares you to fight back. The laughter of a man who thinks he's untouchable. The sun was setting gold, leaking into the edges of the street. I opened my car door, but instead of starting the engine, I just sat there for a moment. My fingers drummed against the steering wheel. I remembered the long nights sanding floors, learning plumbing from online tutorials, the smell of dust and wood glue, the ache in my hands. I'd built that house piece by piece while Martin and his son Todd spent years convincing my mother I was ungrateful for existing outside their orbit. They called it family. I called it survival. At home, I went straight to the drawer in my study and pulled out the thick folder marked Deed and Receipts. Pages of tax payments, closing documents, mortgage statements, every single one signed by me alone. Proof of ownership, and more importantly, proof of patience. My phone buzzed. A message from Marcia, my oldest friend. How was the party? I typed back. Hot. Predictable. But maybe useful. She sent a laughing emoji. Then, "You didn't slap him, did you?" I smiled. "No, I'm done slapping. I'm invoicing." Then I opened the bottom drawer and took out another folder, this one thinner, labeled Martin. Tax. Inside were printouts I'd quietly saved over the past few months, copies of returns, lines that didn't add up, a claim filed under my name year after year as if I were still his dependent, a fraud hidden behind a family name. I stared at those papers for a long time, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the steady sound of my own breathing. "You like records, Martin," I whispered. "Good, because this time they'll speak louder than your mouth." Outside, a lawnmower buzzed somewhere down the street. The neighborhood lights blinked on one by one. I turned off my phone, slid both folders into my briefcase, and closed the latch with a click that sounded almost final. For 10 years, I'd paid for peace. For 10 years, I'd let them insult me at holidays, ask for favors, borrow tools, talk about my house like it was community property. I'd smiled through every one of it, told myself that keeping the peace was the price of family. But sitting there in my quiet kitchen, looking at the proof in my hands, I realized something simple. Peace that costs your dignity is just another kind of tax, and I'd already overpaid. I looked at the folder one last time before turning out the light and said to no one in particular, "Let's make sure they get the bill this time." I was 39 when my mother remarried, and I remember the sound of the church bells that morning more than her vows. My father had been gone for 3 years, long enough for the ache to turn dull, not long enough for me to believe someone else would step into his place. His name was Martin Hensley, a retired electrician with a fondness for beer opinions and stories that got louder with every retelling. He had a son, Todd, who was already an adult, but somehow lived as if adolescence was still an option. I tried to smile through the small talk that day to be polite, to pretend I didn't notice how Martin introduced Todd as his pride and joy, while calling me Elaine's girl. It sounded harmless at first, but even then I heard the separation. 2 families sharing a table, but not a name. A year later, I bought my house. It was a 1940s single-story in South Austin. Pale green paint, peeling like old wallpaper pipes, older than I was, and a roof that sighed every time it rained. The realtor called it a fixer-upper. My friends called it a money pit. I called it a chance. I had saved for years, taking extra hours at the firm, cutting vacations, short-eating noodles in the break room instead of dinners out. When I closed on it in the spring of 2014, it felt like planting a flag on a patch of quiet independence. Mom wanted to help, so she wrote me a check for $10,000, the kind of gentle gesture that mothers make when they still see their grown children as fragile. I accepted it, knowing it would mean something to her. Martin handed me a beer and said with a grin, "See, half that house is ours now." I laughed, thinking it was a joke. Later, I realized it wasn't. Todd appeared a few months after I moved in. He arrived with a truck full of tools and unshaven face and promises to help with renovations. I didn't have the heart to turn him away, not when Mom kept saying, "It'll be good for you two to bond." He stayed a week, then a month, then somehow an entire summer. He broke 2 tiles in the bathroom, left paint cans open in the garage, and used my good towels to wipe engine grease off his hands. Every time I said something, Martin would chuckle, "He's family, don't be dramatic." So I stopped saying things. I worked around the damage, fixed what I could, learned to plaster walls and replace outlets. I even started writing down each repair in a notebook, part budget, part journal. By the end of that year, the notebook had become thicker than the mortgage folder. My hands toughened, my patience did too. I told myself I was learning resilience. When Todd finally left, he didn't say goodbye. He left his junk in the shed and his broken promises in every corner of the house. I cleaned it all up the way I always did. Mom said, "He means well, honey." I smiled. So do termites. That house became my heartbeat. I came home to it every night, tired but proud. I painted the kitchen a pale yellow that caught the morning light, planted rosemary by the steps, replaced the old brass knobs with matte black handles. Each improvement felt like a line in a story I was writing for myself. By 2018, the neighborhood had changed. New coffee shops, better schools, property values climbing like vines. One day, Martin dropped by, leaned against the doorway, looked around and said, "Guess you got lucky." I told him luck didn't haul drywall. He laughed like I'd told a joke, then opened the fridge without asking. Mom followed him in soft voice, smoothing edges. "He's just proud of you." I nodded, but I didn't believe it. Pride never sounded like ownership. That same year, Todd lost another job. He came by again asking if he could crash a few nights. He arrived with a girlfriend, this time the kind who called me ma'am with a smile that wasn't polite. They stayed in the guest room until it became clear they weren't planning to leave. I found beer caps in the sink, lipstick stains on the pillowcases, and a broken lamp in the hall. Martin told me they're trying to get on their feet. I said they seem pretty comfortable standing on mine. It was the first time he looked at me with something sharper than amusement. "Don't forget who helped you with this place," he said. I looked at my hands, calloused from years of repairs, and replied, "I haven't." They moved out a week later, leaving behind a hole in the wall where the doorstop used to be. I patched it myself that night, humming to keep the anger from taking root. By 2022, I made my final mortgage payment. 10 years of steady work, no missed deadlines, no missed dues. I brought the receipt to Mom's house and laid it on the kitchen table like a gift. She cried. Martin poured himself coffee and said, "Well, bloodlines matter. You'll pass it to Todd one day." I almost laughed. The words were too absurd, too bold. "Why would I?" I asked. He shrugged. "He's family. You're single. It'll stay in the line. Something in me clicked quiet but final. That was the moment I understood he'd never seen me as family, only as an inconvenience holding property he wanted. He didn't see a daughter, he saw a wallet. And for the first time, I looked at him and felt nothing. Not anger, not grief, just the cold clarity that comes when you finally recognize a thief who calls himself kin. That night, I opened my notebook again, flipped to a clean page, and wrote at the top in neat block letters, "Everything paid." I closed the book and thought some debts you can't repay, but others you can collect with interest. By the summer of 2023, Austin was a furnace. The heat shimmered off the streets like invisible fire, and even the cicadas sounded tired. I was in my office at Austin Tax Center, a small beige building with humming fluorescent lights and coffee that always tasted faintly of cardboard. Most days were routine. People brought in shoeboxes of receipts. I turned them into order calm in a world of financial chaos. Numbers made sense when people didn't. That morning, I was processing my mother's tax file. She had called sweet and apologetic as always, saying Martin wanted her to keep things tidy before the end of the quarter. I opened the digital folder expecting the usual pensions deductions, the safe predictability of retirement life. Then something caught my eye. A dependent listed under her husband's return, name Janet Rowe. My name. I blinked, checked the filing year again. Not just this year. The same entry went back 5 years. He had claimed both Mom and me as dependents pocketing credits that didn't belong to him. I leaned back, feeling a slow wave of disbelief that hardened into a kind of cold amusement. "So he's been getting refunds off my back," I murmured. The computer's blue light flickered across my glasses, reflecting the exact line where my name sat under his signature. It wasn't just fraud. It was entitlement carved into paperwork. I printed copies quietly, the printer clicking in slow rhythm like a heartbeat. Each page felt heavier than paper should. I placed them in a plain folder and wrote on the front with my neat accountant's handwriting, Hensley, personal. At lunch, I called Amelia Kent, an old friend from the firm days. She had left the corporate grind years ago to start her own practice, small but fierce. When I told her what I'd found, there was a pause. Then her voice came calm and sharp. "You sure about the dates 5 years?" I said. "Every one of them. I've got the filings, digital and hard copies." "That's felony territory," she said. "IRS doesn't joke about that." I smiled faintly. Neither do I. We met later that evening at a cafe on South Congress, the kind that smelled like espresso and burnt ambition. I slid the folder across the table. "Keep this safe. It's about to get funny." She flipped through the papers, one brow arching higher with each page. "You planning to report him?" she asked. "Not yet," I said. "He thinks he's untouchable. I want him to say more first." Amelia nodded slowly. "Be careful, Janet. Men like that get brave when they think they're clever." "Oh, I'm counting on that," I said. The following weeks were strangely quiet. I worked my hours, saw clients, paid bills. But every time I logged into my email, I saw that folder name sitting in my drive, a silent witness. The satisfaction wasn't about revenge, it was about balance. There's a specific peace that comes when you know truth is waiting on your side like a loaded file. One afternoon in late July, Mom invited me for dinner. The air smelled like rain and barbecue smoke, that heavy Texas mix that always warned of a storm. Martin greeted me with his usual forced cheer. "The taxpayer herself," he said. "Hope you're filing on time." "Always," I replied, smiling just enough to make him uncomfortable. During dinner, he talked about Todd's new idea, something about a car wash franchise. He said Todd just needed a little seed money to get started. I kept my voice steady. Seed money or bailout money. He laughed like I'd made a joke, but his eyes stayed on me longer than usual. That night when I got home, I opened Facebook. Martin had posted a picture of Todd standing in front of my house, arms spread like a real estate ad. The caption read, "Todd will inherit the family home one day. Family stays in blood." The photo already had 20 likes from church friends, comments about how proud he must be. My hand hovered over the keyboard for a second before I typed, "And tax bills stay in the mail." I hit send. The reaction was instant. 50 likes within the hour, a few laughing emojis. One of his golf buddies commented, "What's that about Martin deleted the post before midnight?" But the damage was done. People talk fast in small towns, even in big cities, disguised as small ones. The next morning, Mom called. Her voice trembled between embarrassment and concern. "Janet, what did you mean by that comment?" "Just reminding Martin that family doesn't mean free," I said. Silence stretched. "He didn't mean any harm," she whispered. "He just gets proud. He gets sloppy," I replied. "There's a difference." She didn't argue, and I didn't push. Some truths can't be explained without breaking something fragile. The days passed. August pressing down like an oven. Martin stopped calling. Todd posted photos from a lake trip, pretending nothing was wrong. I spent my evenings walking the neighborhood, letting the heat drain the noise out of my head. Every night I'd pass the corner where the streetlight buzzed faintly, and I'd think this is what control feels like, quiet, invisible, and steady. At work I drafted a report but never filed it. I wanted the timing perfect. Karma works best when it arrives dressed as coincidence. The IRS deadline for amendment claims was coming up. I made sure Amelia had everything ready, sealed, and time-stamped. On paper, it looked like a procedural review. In reality, it was the first domino. One afternoon, a colleague glanced at the folder on my desk and asked, "Big case?" I smiled. "Just cleaning house." He laughed, unaware how literal that was. Late that night, I logged into the tax database one last time, watching the numbers align the evidence sitting neatly where it belonged. The truth, like math, doesn't shout. It just waits for its moment to add up. As I shut down my computer, the reflection in the dark screen showed me looking calmer than I had in years. The kind of calm that comes before a reckoning. The air smelled like cedar smoke and bragging. September in Texas has a way of pretending to be autumn while still burning your shoulders, and that Sunday was no exception. I had agreed to the barbecue because Mom insisted. "It'll be good for everyone to be together again," she'd said, which, in family language, usually means, "Please keep the peace." So I made potato salad, cleaned the deck, and set out extra chairs in the backyard. The house gleamed in the afternoon light, the paint crisp, the porch flowers alive despite the heat. It was my quiet pride, my proof of endurance. By 4 o'clock, the yard was full of chatter. The neighbors wandered in with casseroles, beer coolers, and gossip. Someone turned on country music, and laughter started weaving through the air like smoke. Todd arrived in a sleeveless shirt, flip-flops, and that same careless grin that always seemed one comment away from trouble. Martin followed with his usual swagger, carrying a six-pack like a trophy. I greeted them politely, my voice neutral. Mom fussed over the grill, pretending not to notice the way Martin immediately took over, poking at the coals, as if it were his domain. I told myself to breathe. It was only a few hours. I could survive a few hours. For a while, it almost felt normal. The sound of children running, the clinking of glasses, the faint hum of sprinklers from a neighbor's yard. Then Todd leaned against the railing, beer in hand, surveying the house like a king eyeing future land. "I'll repaint that house when it's mine," he said with a smirk. The sentence slipped out so casually that for a second no one reacted. Then a few guests laughed uncertainly, unsure if it was a joke. My jaw tightened. Martin chuckled, slapping Todd on the back. "That's right, son. A man should plan ahead." He looked right at me, eyes glinting. "That 850 KI house belongs to my boy." The laughter died. The only sound was the pop of the grill and the distant bark of a dog. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I just stared at him. My expression steady, the kind of stillness that makes loud men uncomfortable. Inside my head, my own voice whispered, "Let fools finish their sentence before signing their check." Mom froze beside the counter, spatula hovering midair. "Martin, that's not funny," she said softly. "You're embarrassing yourself." "Oh, come on," he said, waving her off. "We're family. Just saying what's true." A murmur spread among the guests, that quiet ripple of secondhand discomfort. One of the neighbors, a young couple from down the street, exchanged looks. I could see a phone, half-raised camera already glowing. I didn't stop them. Todd grabbed another beer, cracked it open, and in his clumsy excitement, knocked the can across the table. Amber liquid spilled over the salad, dripping down the wood, soaking through the paper plates. He laughed. Oops. Guess it's mine now, too. The laughter was his alone. Everyone else went silent. The beer puddled and shimmered in the sun, the smell sharp and sticky. It was such a small moment, yet it felt like the final insult layered over years of quiet theft. I looked at the mess, then at him. My silence was deliberate. There's a kind of power in not giving noise the dignity of a reply. Martin grinned wider, mistaking restraint for weakness. You should lighten up, Janet. It's a party. It's your funeral, I thought, but didn't say. I turned to refill a guest's drink, my voice calm, my hands steady. The tension lingered like humidity. A neighbor coughed. Someone tried to restart the conversation with football talk, but the ease had evaporated. By dusk, the gathering thinned out. People excused themselves early, leaving behind half-eaten ribs and the weight of something unsaid. Martin didn't notice. He was too busy boasting about how property taxes were a joke if you know the right people. Todd bragged about how the market would only rise and how this place will be worth $1 million soon. I cleared plates quietly, every movement measured. When the last guest left, I took a photo of the table, the spilled beer, the empty chairs, the half-burned grill. I didn't know why, maybe to remember what final straws looked like. Later that night, as the house fell into silence, my phone buzzed. A neighbor had tagged me in a video. The thumbnail froze on Martin, mid-sentence, mouth open, arm around Todd beer in hand. The caption read, "Entitled Stepdad claims daughter's home for his son." I tapped play. The clip lasted 12 seconds. His exact words echoed. That 850 KLA house belongs to my boy. In the background, you could hear me exhale softly, then the faint sound of someone murmuring, "Oh my God." The video ended on Todd spilling his drink. By morning, it had 30,000 views. Local pages started sharing it. Someone added text overlays Austin family drama at its finest. Comments poured in. Most were strangers. She deserves better. That man just ended his reputation. The calm woman wins every time. I read every one of them with quiet satisfaction. Justice has many languages. Sometimes it starts with embarrassment. Mom called at noon, her voice small. "It's all over Facebook," she whispered. Martin's mortified. "Good," I said simply. "Janet, please," she started, but her voice cracked. "He didn't mean to." "He always means to," I said. Then softer. But this time everyone heard him. She didn't reply. I could hear her breathing, maybe crying. I didn't feel sorry, not yet. That evening, I stood on the porch, the same place where Martin once told me luck was everything. The sky burned orange, the air smelled of smoke and reckoning. For the first time, I let myself smile. Fame, even the small town kind, has its uses. That video was my opening statement, the proof no courtroom could dismiss. I didn't need to shout. The internet had already done it for me. By the time a week had passed after the barbecue, the smoke smell had left the yard, but it stayed in my mind. Monday morning, I unlocked the office early and let the quiet settle around me like clean air. The copier warmed with a low hum, steady, and patient, the sound of work beginning. I opened the file that held every line of my house story. Deed, mortgage release, annual statements, property tax receipts filed on time and with my name alone. I printed each page and stacked them in order, clean borders, no smudges, no doubts. Then I opened a second folder, the one that did not belong to my house at all. It belonged to a habit. Years of filings where Martin had claimed more than he should and spoken louder than the truth. I checked dates, signatures, and lines where dependents were declared. My name sat there like a trespasser that everyone walks by and pretends not to see. I copied those pages as well, fed them to the machine, watched them slide into a neat stack that looked almost harmless. Paper often does. I wrote a short cover note that said only what was needed. Please review. Possible improper dependent claims across multiple years. Supporting documents enclosed. I placed the note on top of the copies and sealed everything in separate envelopes, one for the Internal Revenue Service, one for the Austin Tax Division. I did not feel like a vigilante. I felt like a clerk in a courthouse who knows where the files go. Justice often begins with a label and a stamp. I walked the envelopes to the mailroom and handed them to the same postal clerk who always greeted me with a kind hello. She weighed them and asked if I needed tracking. I said yes. She slid the receipts across the counter and I tucked them into my purse as carefully as if they were diamonds. Then I sat back at my desk and wrote a letter to my mother. I kept it short because long speeches would only cloud the point. I wrote, "I love you, Mom, but you should know what he has been doing." I added a list of the tax years and a simple sentence that said, "I can show you everything when you are ready." I signed my name. I breathed out. I walked the letter to the blue box outside and let it fall. It made a soft sound on the metal floor like a small door closing. The sky was white with heat and the asphalt shimmered. Inside the office, I checked my calendar and forced myself to handle ordinary tasks. I returned calls. I sorted a bag of mixed receipts that a client had dropped off. I scheduled 2 consultations. Every hour, I printed one more copy of a key page and placed it in a private file that I kept locked. I told myself it was not paranoia. It was good record keeping. That afternoon, I opened social media. Todd had posted a photo from a storage unit. He stood beside stacked boxes with a grin and a caption that said, "Moving soon, big plans." The comments were full of cheerleaders and winks. Friends asked where. He answered with a vague smiley and said, "You will see." I did not argue. I did not warn. I typed nothing but a brief reply that showed a small wave. It was the kind of answer that says I see you. It was also the kind that says nothing at all. I closed the app and turned back to my spreadsheets. Numbers are a comfort when people are not. Columns add up. Columns tell the truth even when a story tries to bend. Late in the day, Amelia called. Her voice sounded like a seatbelt click. Secure and certain. She said the packets were formatted correctly and that the timeline made sense. She reminded me that once submitted, the review would follow its own clock. Some letters move fast, others take their time. I said I understood. I also said I was tired of waiting for men to keep their promises while women kept ledgers. She laughed not unkindly and told me to go for a walk. I did. I circled the block, let the heat wrap my shoulders, and watched a kid on a bike drag a stream of playing cards in his spokes. The sound was like a distant rattle. When I got home, I put the tracking slips in a bowl by the door. I set the house file in the safe. I set the other file beside my bag where I could see it when I drank tea. I wrote a list on a yellow pad. It had 3 lines: mail sent, letter to mom sent. Wait. I underlined wait, and then I put the pen down. Waiting is not passive when you have already moved the first piece. It is the part where you hold your ground. The next days moved like thick syrup. Work, sleep, coffee emails. A neighbor waved from the sidewalk and asked if I had seen the video numbers. I said I was not counting. He said I should. Then he said, "Good for you," and walked on. Mom did not call right away. When she did, her voice had a careful sound. She said she had received my letter and that she would like to talk, but not at home. We met at a diner off South First where the air smelled like toast and strong coffee. She wore a blue blouse and the necklace I gave her the year I paid my last mortgage bill. She looked at me and then at her hands. She said, "Martin can be careless." I said he can be deliberate. She asked if the situation could be fixed quietly. I told her that quiet had been the cover for a long time, and that was enough for both of us today. October came with cooler air, but no peace. The first letter arrived on a Wednesday morning, cream envelope, government seal, Martin's name, printed neat and final. I knew the look of an audit before I even opened my mailbox. By noon, Mom called. Her voice was trembling, the kind that sounds like someone clutching a tissue too tight. She said Martin had received something from the IRS and that he was pacing the house like a caged animal. "He's your stepfather, Janet," she said, the words already rehearsed. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the sunlight cutting through the blinds. "He's your husband, Mom, not my accountant." She started to cry softly, then hung up. I let the silence fill the room. There's a peculiar satisfaction in hearing consequences finally learn your address. Later that afternoon, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, Todd stood there, arms crossed, jaw tight. "You'll regret this," he said. I watched him for a moment, then reached to the side table and picked up a thick envelope. "You left this," I said, handing it to him. He frowned. "What is it, unpaid taxes?" I answered and shut the door before he could respond. Through the glass, I saw him stare for a few seconds, then storm off down the walkway. I returned to my tea. The next morning, I received an email from Amelia with a subject line that said, "Update." The body contained 3 sentences. Audit confirmed. False dependent claim. $18,000 penalty issued. I read it twice, letting each number sink in like rainfall on dry soil. The law had no emotion, but sometimes it knew timing better than poetry. That weekend, my phone buzzed with family group notifications. The chat was usually full of recipes, vacation photos, small talk between cousins who only met twice a year. But now the messages came rapid fire. Martin had told everyone I was trying to ruin him, that I had lied to the government out of spite. One cousin wrote, "You shouldn't mix family and revenge." Another added, "You should apologize to your mother, at least." I scrolled slowly, feeling the usual weight of judgment trying to settle back on me. Then I opened a new message and dropped in a link, irs.gov/public record. I added a short line underneath. Facts don't need opinions. Then I muted the conversation. By evening, half the messages had been deleted. The rest turned quiet. The following day, Mom came by the office. She looked smaller somehow, her shoulders drawn and her voice softer than I remembered. She said Martin was furious that he felt humiliated. "He says you've destroyed his reputation." I looked at her calmly. "He did that when he signed my name under his taxes." She didn't argue. Instead, she asked if I could find a way to fix it. "Fixing it means admitting it happened," I said. She wiped her eyes and nodded. Maybe understanding, maybe just exhausted. When she left, she kissed my cheek like she used to when I was 10 and scraped my knee. Except now she was the one bleeding pride. That night, I cooked myself a quiet dinner, poured a glass of wine, and read the audit notice line by line. It detailed every claim, every year, every refund. Precise, undeniable. It ended with a signature from an IRS officer named Howard Jameson, dated October 12, 2023. The letter said payment due within 30 days or further action would be taken. I almost laughed. 30 days was generous. By the next morning, Martin's business page had been deactivated. His golfing buddy posted a cryptic status about karma catching up fast. Even Todd had gone silent. Austin is a large city that behaves like a small town. News travels faster than reason. By Friday, the neighbors were whispering in driveways. I saw one of them while watering the plants, and she nodded at me with quiet approval. "Good for you," she said. "Men like that think paperwork doesn't bite." I smiled faintly. It does when you file it right. That weekend, another envelope arrived, this one from the IRS, again addressed to me. Inside was a standard acknowledgement of submission, confirming the anonymous report had been processed and verified. I placed it in my safe right beside the deed to my house. Proof of ownership comes in many forms. Sunday evening, Todd posted again for the first time in days. A blurry photo of a bar counter captioned, "Sometimes life hits hard." The comments were sympathetic. I didn't reply. I simply saved the post. Documentation, after all, is a habit. That night, I slept deeply. No dreams, no interruptions. The kind of rest that only comes when justice starts breathing on its own. November came with the kind of cold that makes metal sound sharper. The trees on my street had started to lose their color, and every time the wind hit the porch, I could hear the faint rattle of loose leaves against the railing. Todd was still in the guest house behind my yard, pretending it was temporary, pretending I hadn't given him 30 days to leave. He'd moved in last year just to help with repairs, and I'd tolerated him because it was easier than hearing Martin complain. Now the help had turned into occupation. Every night his truck idled too long in the driveway, music thumping low, his friends coming and going. I counted the days quietly. On November 2nd, I printed the notice to vacate and slipped it under his door. The paper was plain, nothing dramatic, but it carried a weight only ownership can. He didn't mention it for 3 days. Then on the 4th morning, I found the paper taped back to my door with the words, "Not happening," scrawled across it in red marker. I smiled. Resistance often announces its own defeat. I took a photo of the note and sent it to Amelia with the caption, "Exhibit A." By the 2nd week, Todd had missed 2 rent contributions, small gestures he made to look responsible. Amelia filed the petition with the Justice of the Peace Court downtown. The clerk stamped it with the dry efficiency of bureaucracy, and suddenly the situation had shape. A date, a process, a boundary with teeth. The court hearing was set for November 20th. On the morning of the hearing, the air felt lighter. I wore a navy blazer, pressed slacks hair tied back, professional, detached, precise. Todd arrived late in a faded hoodie and jeans, holding a coffee he wasn't allowed to bring inside. Martin didn't show. Only Mom came sitting in the back row with a scarf around her neck, eyes darting between us. When the judge called my name, I stood. Amelia handled most of the talking, her tone calm and surgical. She presented the deed, the mortgage receipts, the utility bills, the photographs, and finally the copy of the notice with Todd's handwriting. The judge read it silently, then raised one eyebrow. "Red marker," he asked. "Yes, Your Honor," Amelia said. "My client believes in documentation." Todd tried to speak, but the judge held up a hand. "Sir, your signature is not on this deed correct. No, but then you have 30 days to vacate. A writ of possession will be issued at the end of that period if compliance is not met." The gavel struck once, a sound like a door locking. Todd stared at me, disbelieving. "You can't do this," he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. I looked at him steadily. "That's the thing about deeds," I said softly. "They don't listen to noise." Mom covered her mouth. The bailiff gestured for Todd to calm down. The rest of the courtroom watched in silence. There's a moment when power shifts so cleanly you can almost hear it change hands. That was mine. Outside, the November wind cut through the hallway. Amelia handed me the final order. "It's done," she said. "He has until December 20th. I nodded. We'll see if he believes in deadlines. The next week was quiet, deceptively so. Todd stopped blasting music. His truck stayed parked motionless like a sleeping threat. He didn't speak to me directly, but I saw him pacing sometimes, phone to his ear, muttering. I spent my evenings reading by the window, the lamp's glow cutting through the early dark. Mom called once, her voice brittle. "He says you've humiliated him." "He humiliated himself," I said. "All I did was turn on the light." She sighed, the kind of sigh that means surrender disguised as fatigue. "Be kind if you can. Kindness has an expiration date, Mom. It was due 5 years ago." On November 28th, the envelope arrived, writ of possession officially granted. I stared at the signature, the seal, the finality. It felt both monumental and strangely calm. Justice rarely comes with fireworks. Sometimes it just arrives folded neatly in the mail. I called the locksmith that afternoon. He scheduled for Friday morning. "Early?" I asked. "Sunrise," he replied. "Perfect." On Friday, just after 7, he arrived in a white van. The air smelled like frost and cedar mulch. I watched from the porch as he unpacked his tools. The sound of metal against metal filled the yard, crisp and final. Todd came out of the guest house barefoot, half asleep, eyes wide. "What the hell are you doing?" "Enforcing a court order," I said evenly. "You were given time. You can't just—" "I can," I said. "The county agrees." The locksmith looked up, once then continued his work. The last screw tightened and he turned the knob, testing the fit. The latch clicked sharp and satisfying. That single sound carried every ounce of balance I'd been missing. The locksmith handed me the new keys. "Good as new," he said. "Good as fair," I replied. Mom stood near the fence, watching everything. She didn't say a word. Her silence wasn't approval or disapproval. It was acknowledgement, the kind that comes when truth no longer needs permission. I walked past her, stopped for a second, and said, "He'll be fine, Mom. Men like him always find somewhere else to overstay." She didn't answer, but when I looked back, I saw her eyes glisten. By evening, the guest house was empty. Todd had packed what he could fit in his truck and left without goodbye. The porch light flickered as his engine faded down the street. I stood at the window long after the sound disappeared. The house felt lighter, almost breathing again. Later that night, I placed the new keys on the table next to the deed and the audit letter. 3 small proofs that words could build walls stronger than bricks. Before going to bed, I stepped outside one last time. The November wind had quieted. The stars over Austin glowed faintly like tiny signatures written across the dark. Somewhere behind me, a door clicked shut. I didn't lock it out of fear. I locked it out of peace. By December, Austin felt smaller. News moved faster than wind, and people who once waved across the fence now turned their heads when Martin passed. Reputation doesn't need an obituary when the IRS writes the headline. His friends stopped calling. The men from his golf club avoided his table at breakfast, pretending not to see him behind the newspaper. At church, the whispers followed him down the aisle like a shadow that couldn't be prayed away. Someone even joked at the diner. "There goes the BBQ guy paying tax now." It spread quick, the kind of gossip that lives longer than truth. Mom couldn't take it. She packed her things quietly and moved in with her sister Carol in Waco. When she called to tell me, her voice was tired. "It's too heavy here," she said. The phone never stops ringing. I told her to rest, to breathe, to let silence do its work. I didn't ask about Martin. I didn't need to. That afternoon, I sent Amelia a short message. The IRS did what I couldn't. She replied with a single thumbs-up emoji and nothing else. There's a comfort in friends who don't require speeches. Days blurred together. My office was quiet during tax-off season, and I filled the hours reviewing old cases, helping clients with year-end planning, anything to keep my hands moving. But even in stillness, justice hums under the surface. On the second week of December, a thick envelope arrived. The handwriting was familiar, messy, masculine, rushed. I opened it carefully. Inside was a letter from Todd. The paper smelled faintly of cheap cologne and regret. "Dad lost his pension," it began. "They said the penalties will take years to clear. Mom's upset. We're moving soon, but I wanted to say I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said those things about the house. Please help him if you can." I read it twice, then folded it neatly and slipped it back into the envelope. I didn't cry, didn't smile. I just placed it on my desk beside a pile of unpaid property tax receipts, the ones Martin had once bragged about never worrying over. After dinner, I scanned the letter and emailed it to Amelia. Subject line: "Forwarded for record. No message in the body." She replied 3 minutes later with a single line: "Understood." I didn't answer. Some silences are heavier than words. The next morning, I learned through a mutual acquaintance that Martin had agreed to a civil settlement with the IRS. The terms were brutal, but fair. In exchange for avoiding criminal referral, he'd accepted a structured repayment plan and a 1-year obligation to pay property tax on the house listed under my name. I laughed when I heard it. A clean, steady laugh that startled even me. He was literally paying tax for the house he once claimed was his. Karma doesn't write poetry, it files invoices. Later that week, Mom called again. She said Martin was trying to make peace, that he blamed bad advice and stress. I let her talk until she ran out of excuses. Then I said, "He didn't lose money, Mom. He just met accountability." She went quiet, and for once she didn't argue. Christmas came and went quietly. No cards, no phone calls, no family dinners. The house was peaceful, its silence solid and earned. I baked cookies for the neighbors, even the ones who had watched from their windows during the drama. Most smiled, a few avoided eye contact. One woman whispered, "You handled it with grace." I thanked her and thought grace doesn't mean soft, it means controlled fire. On New Year's Eve, I sat by the window with a glass of wine and watched fireworks over the city. Somewhere Martin was probably counting his payments, Todd pretending everything was fine, and Mom trying to find comfort in someone else's spare room. I didn't feel triumph. What I felt was distance, clean and absolute. I thought about every moment that led here, the BBQ humiliation, the years of small disrespect, the quiet nights filling out forms while men laughed about being clever. Every line, every receipt, every signature had been a seed. Now the harvest was simply the truth, written in their own ink. Before bed, I placed Todd's letter in a folder marked Archive. Not vengeance, just documentation. A record of what happens when someone mistakes kindness for permission. As I turned off the lights, I whispered to the empty room. "You're finally free, Janet." The words sounded strange at first, then natural. The kind of sentence that doesn't need anyone else to believe it to be real. The last week of December brought a stillness that felt almost ceremonial. The city slowed down after Christmas, the traffic lighter, the air crisp. I was in my office sorting through end-of-year files when I heard a knock on the door. A soft, deliberate knock. I looked up to see Martin standing in the doorway holding a bouquet of lilies. The absurdity nearly made me laugh. He looked smaller than I remembered, the weight of months of scandal pressing into the lines of his face. His suit hung loose, his shoes polished, but scuffed at the edges like a man trying to remember what dignity feels like. "Janet?" He began, voice cautious. "I thought maybe it's time we put all this behind us." He stepped closer, setting the flowers gently on my desk as if they were a peace treaty. I came to say, "I'm sorry. For everything that happened. For the misunderstanding." I kept my expression neutral. "Which misunderstanding are we talking about exactly? The fraud, the harassment, or the public humiliation?" His mouth twitched, but he forced a smile. "You've made your point. I just thought maybe we could find a way to move forward. I can help maintain the property, maybe handle the landscaping, the repairs, whatever needs doing. Let's make peace." I studied him for a long moment, then reached into my drawer and pulled out a white envelope. I slid it across the desk toward him. "You already maintain it," I said, my voice calm, steady. "Every quarter. With your tax payments." He froze his fingers, hovering above the envelope. The color drained from his face as if the realization hit twice, once for the insult, once for the truth. "You don't have to be cruel," he muttered. "Cruel?" I leaned forward slightly. "Cruel is telling someone their home belongs to your son. Cruel is stealing comfort and calling it family. This is just math, Martin. You're paying for what you claimed was yours. I'd call that balance." He stood there for another few seconds, then straightened his jacket, trying to recover what was left of his pride. "You'll regret treating family this way," he said quietly. I smiled faintly. I stopped mistaking family for ownership a long time ago. He left without another word. The lilies stayed on the desk, unopened and unwanted. After he was gone, I stared at them for a while before dropping them gently into the trash can. They hit the liner with a soft rustle that felt more final than any argument. That evening, I wrote a short email to Amelia Audit closed. Flowers received. "Thank you for your service." She responded almost instantly. "Frame the receipt." I laughed out loud. Humor, it turns out, is the last language of freedom. Days later, Todd reached out. The message came through text, short and desperate. "Hey, Janet, I need a place for a few weeks. Things are rough. Can I stay in the guest house just for a month? I'll pay rent, I swear." I stared at the screen for a long time before typing back. "Come by tomorrow morning. We'll discuss terms." When he arrived, he looked like someone who had aged 5 years in 5 months. The confidence, the smirk, the cheap defiance, all gone. "Thank you for even considering this," he said, hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. "I'll find a way to make it right. I just need a place to land for a bit." I nodded toward the table where a few papers were laid out. "Then let's make it official." He blinked. "Official A lease," I said simply. 30 days. Legal rent. You'll sign and you'll contribute to the property tax as a tenant. No signature, no stay. He hesitated, his mouth opening and closing like he wanted to argue, but didn't dare. Finally, he nodded. "Okay, I'll sign." As he scribbled his name on the line, I watched in silence. The sound of the pen scratching paper was oddly satisfying, like a record being corrected. When he finished, I took the form, slipped it into a folder, and said, "Welcome to your temporary residence. Rent's due on the 1st. He looked up, unsure whether I was joking. I wasn't. As he left, I noticed how carefully he closed the door behind him, the way people do when they're entering someone else's space with respect. That was new. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table sipping tea, watching the sunset bleed orange over the rooftops. I thought about how far things had shifted, how the same man who once shouted "my house" belonged to his son now paid quarterly for its upkeep, and how that son had signed a lease under my terms. Not revenge, just order. Justice doesn't need to shout. It only needs to balance the books. Before heading to bed, I checked my email one last time. Amelia had sent another note. When people show up with flowers, she wrote, "Make sure the receipts still say they owe you." I smiled, closed the laptop, and whispered into the quiet house. Message received. January arrived quiet and cold, the kind of winter that makes Texas light look metallic. The holidays were gone, the decorations packed, and the city exhaled into a slow routine. Todd had moved back into the guest house under the terms we agreed on, and to my faint surprise, he kept his word. On the 1st of the month, a white envelope appeared under my office door. Inside was a check neatly written, the handwriting careful, almost rehearsed. Paid to Janet Rowe. Amount $1,200. I stared at the name for a long while, letting it sink in. It wasn't about the money. It was the first tangible acknowledgement of something long overdue. I placed the check in a small black frame and set it on the bookshelf next to the property deed. A quiet exhibit of justice, understated but complete. That evening, as I made tea, I caught myself smiling. Not a triumphant smile, but one that carried a calm weight. Every quarter now, the same man who once declared my home belonged to his son paid taxes on it, while that same son paid rent to live in its shadow. There are symmetries that even poetry couldn't craft better. A week later, Mom stopped by. She looked fragile, smaller somehow, her hair tied back her coat, hanging loosely. "I wanted to see you," she said softly. I was nearby. I let her in, and we sat in the kitchen, surrounded by the faint smell of cinnamon and paperwork. She looked around slowly, her gaze resting on the framed check. "Is that?" "The first rent payment," I said. "On time in full." She stepped closer, her eyes glistening. "He really did it, yes," I said. "He finally contributed." Her lips trembled between pride and sorrow. "It shouldn't have come to this," she whispered. I met her gaze evenly. Maybe it always had to. Some people only learn respect when it's itemized. She looked down, then reached for my hand, her palm cool and trembling. "I'm sorry, Janet." It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, small, but real. I squeezed her hand once before letting go. "Don't cry, Mom," I said gently. "He's finally contributing." She laughed weakly, wiped her eyes, and nodded. Before she left, she glanced around the house, the wooden floors, the warm light, the quiet sense of order. "You built this," she said, "every inch of it, and I paid for every inch of it," I replied softly. When she walked out, I stood by the door for a long while, watching her car disappear down the street. The silence she left behind wasn't empty. It was peaceful. Later that night, I opened a thick binder labeled Closure. Inside were copies of tax receipts, bank statements, court orders, and photos of the house at different stages of renovation. I slipped the rent check copy inside, right next to the IRS acknowledgement and the eviction order. Together they formed a timeline not of vengeance, but of reclamation. Every document was a proof of survival written in ink and persistence. I ran my fingers over the pages, tracing the rhythm of it all. It was strange how the sound of paper could feel like peace. A week later, a notice arrived in the mail. Martin's pension had been formally reduced by half due to tax garnishments. Amelia sent me the breakdown. Half of his quarterly payments now went directly to the property tax, Rowe residence account. I sat at my desk reading the statement, twice the irony unfolding slowly. He was quite literally paying for the house he once claimed belonged to his bloodline. The law had a sense of humor I had come to admire. That night, I walked through each room of the house, pausing by the framed check again. The ink had dried into permanence, my name steady his signature, a faint echo beneath it. Justice doesn't always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it comes in steady payments, predictable, procedural, almost boring in its perfection. I lit a candle, placed it by the window, and watched its reflection flicker across the glass. Outside, the wind brushed against the garden, carrying the faint hum of a city that had finally forgotten my name. No more whispers, no more stares, just the quiet hum of a neighborhood moving on. Todd kept to himself now, polite and subdued. He sent texts about maintenance issues, paid on time, and didn't cross boundaries. Maybe life had finally taught him what pride couldn't. One evening, I found a small envelope slipped under my door again. Inside was another check, this one, with a short note. "Thank you for letting me stay. I'll be gone by spring." I folded the note and placed it in the binder under miscellaneous. Closure isn't about ending everything. It's about knowing where to file it. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I passed the framed check one last time. The soft reflection of the lamp danced across the glass, and for the first time in years, the house felt entirely mine, not just in paper, but in peace. Spring came early that year. The air in Austin softened, wildflowers pushed through cracks in the sidewalks, and the city started smelling faintly of cedar and rain. I spent most mornings on the porch with coffee watching the garden fill out again. The same garden Todd once trampled through without thought was now blooming with quiet discipline, every stem standing where it should. I had started keeping a journal, something Amelia had suggested. "Write down what justice feels like when it's quiet," she'd said. And so I did. Most entries were short, practical notes about the property tax reminders and quarterly updates. But every so often I found myself writing things like, "It was never about money. It was about respect." It felt good to see it written like a truth, finally finding its proper home. One afternoon in late March, I received a letter in the mail. The envelope was familiar, the handwriting elegant. My mother's. I sat at the kitchen table and opened it carefully. Inside was a folded sheet of stationery, cream-colored with soft blue ink. Her words were simple but steady. I see now who was paying all along. I was wrong to stay quiet. I know what love looks like now, and it looks like accountability. I read it 3 times before setting it down. Forgiveness is a peculiar currency. It loses value when handed out too easily. I picked up a pen and wrote her back. "Forgiveness isn't free. It's earned like taxes. But I still love you." I sealed the letter. No flourish, no drama, just balance. A few days later, the neighborhood association held its spring meeting at the community center. It was the first time I had attended one since the infamous BBQ months ago. As I walked in, people smiled politely. Some hesitated, but most were kind. The whispering had faded, replaced with nods of recognition, quiet respect. The president, an older man named Frank, tapped the microphone and said, "Before we begin, I just have to say no one hosts BBQs like the Rows anymore." Laughter rippled through the crowd. I let it breathe, then smiled and replied, "Especially the ones where I own the grill." The room erupted again, not with mockery, but with warmth. Even the laughter had changed tone, no longer sharp, no longer pitying. It felt earned. After the meeting, a few neighbors came up to chat. One woman said, "You handled everything with such grace. I would have lost my mind." I smiled gently. Grace is just patience with paperwork. She laughed, not quite understanding, but sincere. I left early, walking home under the soft evening light. The house glowed from within, as if it understood the peace it had fought for. Inside, I poured a glass of wine and opened the binder one last time. The cover now read, "Paper Trails." Inside were all the documents that had defined the battle. The audit letter, the court orders, the rent checks, the tax receipts, even a photo from the BBQ that had started it all. I flipped through them, slowly remembering each milestone. Not one of them felt bitter. They were proof not of revenge, but of resilience. I thought about Martin somewhere across town, his pension halved, his pride adjusted to reality. About Todd, who had moved out quietly after his lease ended, leaving a short note on the counter that read, "Thank you for letting me grow up here." I pinned that note at the back of the binder. It felt right to keep it not as sentiment, but as evidence that even arrogance can learn. The wind outside shifted, brushing against the window. I thought of Mom again, perhaps sitting at her sister's kitchen table reading my letter, and knowing that silence was no longer our family's language. I hoped she understood that I wasn't angry anymore. Anger is loud and temporary. What I had now was quieter, sharper, more permanent. The kind of peace you earn when you stop asking for approval. As night settled, I stepped outside. The porch light glowed warm, the same place where the story began months ago, with laughter, smoke, and humiliation. The same space where I had once stood invisible, now stood reclaimed. The house wasn't just a structure anymore, it was a record, a declaration in wood and light. Before heading in, I whispered to no one in particular, "It's over." The wind carried it somewhere past the trees toward whatever was next. Then I smiled because closure doesn't roar, it exhales. Epilogue, 112 words. Karma doesn't knock loud, it just sends the bill itemized, sealed, and right on time. If you've ever paid the price for someone else's comfort, you know the weight of pretending peace means surrender. It doesn't. Peace is what happens when truth gets the last word. The receipts, the records, the quiet, all of it was worth it. This wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about proving I didn't need to beg for what was already mine. If you've ever stood up to family and refused to shrink, tell me what justice would look like for you. Because sometimes the softest revenge is simply being right in public.